Hello, thank you for allowing me to join you, at least electronically, today as you commemorate 1808, Fighting for the Right to Dream. My name is Stephen Kimber, and I'm a professor of journalism here at the University of King's College in Halifax, Canada. That's my day job, but I also write books, and my most recent book is one called Loyalists and Layabouts, The Rapid Rise and Faster Fall of Shelburne, Nova Scotia, 1783 to 1792. Now, the book generally tells the story of a small group of British loyalists who, after the American Revolution, decided that they were going to establish a new, bigger, better, more cosmopolitan, and certainly more loyal New York City on the shores of Nova Scotia. Now, we know that it turned out to be a spectacular failure. Shelburne, the little town which was the place where this was all to happen, is now a picturesque little coastal fishing community of about 3,000 people on the south shore of Nova Scotia. But back in the day, in the years after the American Revolution, it was briefly the fourth largest city in North America. That is the story, the larger story of the book. But within that story is the equally interesting story of a small group of black freed slaves who came as part of the group that came to Shelburne to establish themselves in their new land and with their new freedom. And they established the first freed black community in North America. They were also involved in what became one of the first race riots in North America the following year. Within the decade, things had gotten so bad that most of them had left Nova Scotia and gone to Africa as part of the Back to Africa movement. But I thought today we'd focus on their story as it was lived in Nova Scotia. I'm going to go back a little bit before that to talk briefly about how they got to this point. And as many of you will know, during the early stages of the American Revolution, the British promised the slaves their freedom if only they'd abandon their masters and fight on the side of the king. Now, they were not doing this necessarily for good reasons. It was much more a matter of tactics. If they could convince the slaves to leave their masters, then the masters might be less likely to leave the plantations to take up arms against the British, because there wouldn't be people back on the plantations to do the work that was required. And they would also be questioning the loyalty of those who they left behind, and be wondering all the time whether or not the plantation was in safe hands. So it was a tactical measure, as was the British use of blacks in certain cases as weapons of war, where they would send them, those who had become infected with smallpox, which was rampant in the black community at the time. They would send them back across the enemy lines so that they could infect Americans. So it was clearly not the best interests of the black slaves that the British had in mind. But nonetheless, the blacks did fight bravely and well in the American Revolution. And at the end of the war, the question was, did the British really mean it when they promised freedom, land, provisions, and an opportunity for the blacks to make a new life for themselves as freed citizens? At first it didn't seem so. Under Article 7 of the peace treaty negotiated between the British and the Americans, the British had agreed to leave New York with all convenient speed, quote, without causing any destruction or carrying away any Negroes or other property of American inhabitants. Now, there were rumors about this clause that swept through the city, and particularly among the black community in the city of New York, and caused great fear and consternation. Luckily, for a variety of reasons, again, all not altruistic, Guy Carleton, who was the British commander in New York, decided the British had to live up to their promise. And he met with Washington on May 6, 1783, just outside New York, and they had a very heated argument over what Article 7 meant. It's worth remembering that some of Washington's own slaves had escaped and were at the time in New York, hoping to sail away with the other freed black slaves. So Washington wanted them returned, and he clearly also wanted the other slaves, which he considered the property of the slaveholders, the legitimate property of the slaveholders, returned to them as per the treaty. Carleton said the treaty's exact wording was much less important than Britain's word of honor to the the blacks who had fought on their behalf. And he also argued that the Negroes couldn't be considered property anymore because they'd already been freed by the British, so how could they be property? Carleton had set up a register known as the Book of Negroes, and he appointed one of his officers, a man named Samuel Birch, to check the bona fides of each black loyalist. They had to meet certain conditions, including having been behind British lines for a year before the end of the Revolution. And if they did meet those criteria, he would give them a certificate so that they could sail, a certificate of freedom. Carleton won his argument with Washington that day largely because the first ships containing the black loyalists had already begun to sail, and Carleton told Washington that if he didn't like it, he could appeal to a tribunal that was being set up. So 3,000 blacks sailed to Nova Scotia that summer. About 1,500 of them settled in what became known as Birchtown, named, of course, after Colonel Birch, the man who had given them the certificates of freedom. Unfortunately, that was the closest most of them got to real freedom. And it was in Nova Scotia where that British promise met reality. They were given the worst land possible. The land that the whites were given was not always fertile or productive, but the blacks got even worse. And what made that even worse was that the whites wanted that land too, because they didn't believe, in spite of the British promises during the war, that there was any obligation to the blacks. And they also, in many cases, had slaves of their own that they'd brought with them, and they didn't want them to get ideas. The white loyalists were a mixed bag. Many of them were wealthy, and they came here to Nova Scotia and they built fine homes. They aped London fashions. They had fancy dress balls. But they really wanted to continue to treat blacks as if they were slaves. And so even though many of the blacks ended up could technically say they were free because they were no longer slaves, but they had few resources for survival, and so they either had to become day laborers. They were paid less than whites, and that was part of the cause of the riots the next summer. Or if they weren't day laborers, they became indentured servants, which in the end was really just a nicer name for being a slave. Theoretically, the difference was that there was a defined period for them to be indentured servants, but that was ignored most of the time. They were often traded and sold, passed along in wills, just like slaves. And they were treated badly in addition to that. The white loyalists would often list the servants as dependents so that they would qualify for the British rations that were being handed out in the early days of the settlement, but they never gave any of those rations to the blacks, or very few of the rations that they were supposed to get. If the black loyalists disobeyed or displeased their white employers, the whites would go to friendly white judges who would order them punished, and often severely. While whites who were convicted of petty crimes often got off with a fine, blacks were jailed or sentenced to hard labor, sometimes even the lash, sometimes, in fact, all three. And there were laws forbidding Negro dances and frolics in places like Shelburne. So it isn't surprising that in 1791, when John Clarkson, an abolitionist from Britain, arrived in Nova Scotia with a scheme to allow the black settlers who wanted to return to the land of their forefathers in Africa, that many were very interested. Clarkson, of course, was part of that British anti-slavery movement, and he wanted to establish a free settlement of blacks in Africa for those who'd been stolen from their homes and made slaves many years before. More than could be accommodated wanted to travel with Clarkson to Africa, and in the end, 1,200 men, women, and children sailed from Halifax to Sierra Leone in January 1792. How they survived there, of course, is another story for another day. I hope I've given you a brief window on that earlier, interesting, little-known story of the black loyalists in Nova Scotia, and I certainly wish I was with you in Toledo today to answer any questions you might have. But you're certainly more than welcome to write to me at Stephen, S-T-E-P-H-E-N, .Kimber, K-I-M-B-E-R, at ukings.ns.ca. Thank you for listening, and I hope you've had a good conference. Take care.